Chapters 21 and 22 of Napoleon and Marie-Louise, The Fall of the Empire, by Walter Geer. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 21. 1810. The Polish Treaty. It is a natural trait of human nature to feel a sudden regret at the loss of an opportunity which we have disdained, when we see another seize it. This seems to have been the feeling of Alexander when he first heard of the Austrian marriage. But he had too much pride to display his pique openly. It was only in his private talks with Caulaincourt that he did not hesitate to say that he thought the Emperor might have shown more consideration and delicacy. In what an embarrassing position they would all have been placed if the Russian answer had been an acceptance of the Emperor's demand instead of a refusal. "It is fortunate," said Alexander, "that the age of my sister stopped us here. Where would we be now if I had used less consideration for my mother, if I had shown less respect for her rights? What reproaches also would I not have had to make to you! The delays of which you then complained were therefore only the part of wisdom." Although Alexander continued to reiterate on all occasions his best wishes for the happiness of his ally, it was evident that he looked for an early rupture. This was also the general expectation in the three capitals most interested: Paris, Vienna, and St. Petersburg. The members of the Austrian embassy at Paris made no attempts to conceal their joy and their confidence. This feeling was shared by the princes of the Confederation of the Rhine. Dalberg wrote Metternich at Vienna, "You can be sure of one thing, that in 5 months we shall be cold toward Russia, and in less than 18 months at war with her." At Petersburg there was an explosion of wrath against the Empress mother, who was generally blamed for the failure of the marriage, and she was insulted in the streets. There was a revolution in public sentiment, as Caulaincourt wrote Talleyrand, and those who had been the most opposed to the continental system were the first to cast the stones. The advantages of the French alliance, so depreciated before, were vaunted on all sides. Every one wished to become French as France drew away. The cabinet of Vienna, formerly so obsequious, assumed an air of cold dignity; and England sent a swarm of secret agents who knocked at every door, and whispered that Russia, repudiated by France, had no other refuge except with her old and true friend. In the midst of all these disturbing incidents there came, like a clap of thunder out of a clear sky, the news that Napoleon had refused to ratify the Polish treaty, and had sent a substitute. After much deliberation, the Russian cabinet drew up a third form for the treaty, as a substitute for the second proposed by Napoleon. Instead of saying bluntly, "The kingdom of Poland shall never be re-established," it read, "His Majesty the Emperor of the French, wishing to give to his ally and to Europe a proof of his desire to deprive the enemies of the peace of the continent of all hope of troubling it, pledges himself, as also His Majesty the Emperor of Russia, that the kingdom of Poland shall never be re-established." The first Russian plan was a death sentence; the second was the same decree, with an explanation of the reasons for it. The Russian counter project was dispatched from St. Petersburg on the 17th of March, with instructions to Kourakin to present it to the Emperor for his signature, without allowing the slightest modification. At the same time, while soliciting Napoleon to wipe Poland forever off the map, Alexander, with his incurable propensity for double dealing, laid plans to re-establish Poland himself. Prince Adam Czartoryski, for many years the most intimate friend of Alexander, had returned to St. Petersburg during the preceding autumn. After the final partition of Poland in 1795, the Empress Catherine had demanded that the illustrious family of Czartoryski should send its sons to her as hostages, under pain of confiscation of their fortune in case of refusal. The young Prince Adam was given a commission in the Russian Guards, and was well treated by the Empress. He was thus thrown with the Grand Duke Alexander, then 18 years of age, who was the eldest son of the Czarowitz Paul, and a great friendship sprung up between the two young men. At that time, Alexander was full of romantic ideas of liberty, fraternity, and equality, and strongly opposed to the arbitrary regime of his grandmother. When his friend talked to him of liberty for the Poles, the words found an echo in his heart. He pitied these unfortunate people, and promised one day to console them for all that they had suffered. They talked of re-establishing Poland, of giving her a national existence, and binding her to Russia by the closest bonds. 5 years later, Alexander was called to the throne, after the tragic death of his father, of which the remembrance must have always weighed upon his conscience. Once in power, he found himself tied by the traditional policy of his house. He was forced to abandon his altruistic schemes, and to reign as his predecessors had done. Nevertheless, he continued his friendly relations with Czartoryski, who was placed in the Bureau of Foreign Affairs, and later was given charge of this department. He presented to the Czar several plans for the restoration of Poland, and once almost secured his promise. But little by little Alexander was led to modify his ideas, until he came to regard the renaissance of Poland, in any form whatsoever, as the gravest peril to the security and unity of his empire. In his relations with Napoleon, Alexander had constantly pursued an equivocal and vacillating policy, conserving the alliance while failing to fulfill its duties. But Napoleon was no longer satisfied with half measures. Alexander must belong to him entirely, or not at all. Fearing an early rupture of their relations and a possible invasion, in which case Poland would be a powerful arm in the hands of his adversary, Alexander returned to the dream of his youth. He decided to anticipate the plans of Napoleon, and himself bind Poland to his empire by ties of gratitude. He would restore to Poland her name, her laws, her institutions, her language. He would erect the state into an independent kingdom, and place the crown upon his brow as Napoleon had assumed the Iron Crown of Lombardy. The Czar of all the Russias would become also the King of Poland. If the people of the Grand Duchy were now attached to Napoleon, it was because they saw in him their only hope. If they beheld upon their frontier a revived kingdom of Poland, they would abandon the cause of Napoleon, to join hands with their compatriots. Without doubt this would mean war with France; a rupture of the alliance without apparent motive or cause. But Alexander was now so persuaded of the imminence of a conflict with Napoleon, that he thought he would secure an advantage in beginning hostilities himself. He had already forgotten the lessons which Austria and Prussia had learned, to their sorrow. At first this project of the Czar was a secret within his own breast, of which he did not speak even to his friend, but the return of the Polish treaty, unratified, and the unexpected news of the Austrian marriage, fortified his resolution. His head was suddenly full of the plans which for 10 years had lain dormant in his mind. In his Memoirs, Czartoryski gives a circumstantial recital of the 2 interviews he had with Alexander in March and April 1810, at which these projects were discussed at length. But the plans which 10 years earlier the prince would have heard with transports of joy, now found him uncertain and troubled. He doubted the sincerity of Alexander, who had habituated all the persons around him to look, in his resolutions, for motives different from those which he advanced. Nevertheless, at the repeated solicitations of the Czar, he promised to submit in writing a plan for gaining the hearts of the Poles. In all these talks with Czartoryski, Alexander had acted without the knowledge or advice of his minister Rumantzoff, who had no confidence in the stability of the Poles. As careful as he had been, it was impossible for Alexander to keep his secret entirely to himself. In the light of this double dealing, is it strange that Prince Adam had little confidence in the sincerity of his friend, and that Napoleon felt that the aim of his ally in the Polish treaty was less to bind him morally than to undermine his credit with the Poles? After several days of study and reflection, the prince prepared his memorandum, and read it to the Czar. As he was entirely in the dark as to the real intentions of Alexander, his plan was necessarily vague and uncertain. After discussing the matter at some length, they separated without reaching any conclusion. Czartoryski tells us that he had never seen Alexander so discouraged since the day of Austerlitz. When the young monarch and his staff galloped off the field of battle, carried away by the torrent of the defeat, while behind them from afar arose the prolonged cheers of the victorious French, saluting their Emperor as he rode along their ranks. On the evening of the 1st of April, when Champagny returned from the civil marriage at St. Cloud, he found 2 letters from the Chancellor Rumantzoff. In the first he announced the new treaty, which had been transmitted by Prince Kourakin; and in the second he stated that he should call soon in regard to this important matter. The papers were all forwarded to Napoleon at Compiegne, where he had returned with Marie-Louise 3 days after the marriage. At this moment the Emperor was little disposed to consider the Polish treaty. Married only a few days before, his time and his thoughts were all devoted to his young bride. He was content with his wife, with her family, and also with the extraordinary representative whom the Court of Vienna had accredited to him in the person of Comte de Metternich. This minister had not come, as was feared at St. Petersburg, with the intention of offering Napoleon a treaty and an alliance. Metternich was too astute a diplomatist to precipitate matters. His idea was to form a stable understanding between Austria and France, and obtain some mitigation of the more onerous articles of the late peace, while always treasuring in his secret thoughts the hope of one day turning against Napoleon at an opportune moment, and avenging the wrongs of his country. But in April, 1810, that epoch seemed a long way off, and neither he nor any one else then dreamed that the day was so near at hand. For the moment the only aspiration of Austria was to be allowed to live at peace, and to secure all the small advantages possible from the new family connection with her redoubtable adversary. In the meantime, the object of Metternich was to cultivate the friendship of the conqueror, insinuate Austria in his good graces, and create between the two courts an intimacy susceptible of being transformed later into an alliance. For this role no one was better equipped. Possessed of rare political aptitudes, full of assurance, he did not display in the presence of the Emperor the embarrassment which paralyzed so many others. He knew how to listen and how to speak. Better than any one he understood the means, by an adroit address, of causing the value of the Austrian Entente to be appreciated. For the success of Metternich's plans it was necessary to bring about a break with Russia, and to that end he devoted all of his energies. At present, Napoleon still regarded a rupture of the alliance as a remote contingency, but he had already begun to realize the truth of the prediction of Cambacérès, that a coldness on the part of the Czar would be the inevitable result of the Austrian marriage. At Compiegne, where he was received on the most intimate terms, Metternich found the field open for his manoeuvres. Feeling sure that the excitement at St. Petersburg would increase rather than diminish, he alluded in guarded terms to the probable attitude of the Czar. "As our dearest wish," he said, "is for peace and tranquillity, it cannot enter into our views that Russia should compromise herself." "What do you mean by compromise herself?" demanded the Emperor. "Russia only acts through fear," replied the minister. "She fears France. She is going to fear our relations with that power, and from inquietude to inquietude she is going to move." With a rare foresight Metternich had predicted the future attitude of Alexander, and had divined, by a secret intuition, the equivocal course which he was then pursuing. "Make your mind easy," continued Napoleon. "If the Russians wish to compromise themselves, I shall pretend not to understand them." But his words soon showed that he was far from taking this detached attitude. He spoke bitterly of the bad faith of Alexander in 1809, his failure to live up to the obligations of his alliance, and Metternich realized that the rupture of the alliance was much nearer than he had dared to hope. From that moment he devoted all of his efforts to the cultivation of the seed of misunderstanding which he saw had been sown between France and Russia. Immediately after these talks with Metternich, the Emperor received the text of the new treaty sent from Russia. At the first glance his attention was arrested by the phrase that "the kingdom of Poland shall never be re-established." He was naturally displeased at this insistence upon a formula which he had once rejected, and was at a loss to understand the motives of Russia. He immediately dictated a very strong reply, which he sent to Champagny to put in diplomatic form. What Russia demands of him is a guarantee of his intentions; he has given it by his conduct and his language. In 1807, after Friedland, in 1809 after Wagram, he could have reconstituted Poland, and he did not do so. In his letters to the Czar, in his address to the Corps Legislatif, he has affirmed that the re-establishment of the Polish kingdom does not in any way enter into his views. He has surabundantly proved it in offering to pass a treaty, the first article of which prohibits him from lending any support whatsoever to any attempts at restoration. The dogmatic assertion that "Poland shall never be re-established" is contrary to usage and human prudence. No matter how strong the empires of France and Russia may be, there is a limit to their powers. The divinity alone can speak in the manner proposed by Russia, and it would be impossible to find a parallel statement in the annals of history. He cannot go further than to affirm in letters, discourses, and treaties, that he will not favor it, will not do it, and will not aid it. During the 3 weeks which he passed at Compiègne before leaving for the north, Napoleon had many long talks with Metternich. After the Empress had retired, he detained the minister, and while walking up and down the long gallery of the Château, gave himself up to that love of talking which grew on him with age. In these intimate conversations, Napoleon showed the grandeur of his thoughts and also the feeble side of his character. Like all parvenus, he had a weakness for men of distinguished name and courtly manners, especially when they also possessed great intellects. Take Talleyrand, for example, whom he had overwhelmed with reproaches without entirely dismissing him; whom he continued to consult while despising him. Metternich was too shrewd to agree always with the Emperor; with him flattery was raised to the point of a fine art. In the words of Talleyrand, he was one of those who know how "to stroke the lion's mane." Napoleon was not ready as yet to precipitate matters with Russia, so when Champagny presented for his approval the note in reply to Russia, he put off sending it, and instructed the minister to tell Kourakin that he was ignorant of the Emperor's views regarding the counter project, as he had worked very rarely with His Majesty since his marriage. On the 16th of May Champagny also wrote Caulaincourt to the same effect. In short, Napoleon adopted the same evasive tactics for which he had so justly reproached the Czar only a few months before. His final thought is expressed in the despatch of 30th of April from Champagny to Caulaincourt. "May you find some expedient calculated to satisfy Russia. His Majesty does not wish Russia to be dissatisfied with the result of these negotiations." 22. 1810. The Journey to Belgium. During the first year of his marriage to Marie-Louise, Napoleon devoted nearly all of his time to her, often to the neglect of the affairs of his empire. Up to this time he had never changed his mode of life to please any woman; now he modified his entire existence. Formerly he had eaten a hasty luncheon, served on a small stand in his cabinet, and had rarely spent more than 20 minutes at the dinner table. Now he lunches and dines every day with the Empress at a fixed hour, and waits without a sign of impatience for her to consume a 12-course repast from hors d'oeuvre to dessert. He had always loved open wood fires, but Marie-Louise preferred the large German stoves, to which she was used, and fires were abolished. "I do not fear Napoleon," she said to Metternich, "but I begin to think that he is afraid of me." This was true. He actually stood in awe of this stupid young Austrian girl, simply because she was a daughter of the German Caesars. He called meetings of his ministers and kept them waiting for hours before he appeared. He refused to read important dispatches, and let the couriers wait days for his replies. Affairs in Spain were going from bad to worse, and his presence in the peninsula was absolutely required. His horses and campaign equipment were waiting at Bayonne, and he thrice announced his departure, but cancelled the orders at the last moment. "Genius," says Carlyle, "means the transcendent capacity of taking trouble." To this Napoleon owed his success. No man in history ever worked harder than he. For 25 years he toiled from 12 to 16 hours a day, and rarely took more than 4 or 5 hours of sleep. When from the Baltic to Gibraltar, from the Channel to the Adriatic, the great French Empire depended on one man, who regulated and controlled everything, it required only a slight slowing up of the motor for the machinery no longer to function properly. As Napoleon issued fewer and briefer orders, they were frequently misunderstood, and often badly executed. This was particularly the case in Spain, where the disagreements among the marshals and their contempt for the authority of King Joseph had a disastrous effect. In his second marriage Napoleon had dealt a severe blow to his popularity in France. He had risen from the ranks of the common people to the highest place in the state. But the people were proud of him and of his glory. He was their emperor, elected by their votes, and his grandeur belonged to them all. In place of their emperor, however, they now beheld a sovereign, who, like the ancient kings, felt that his power was based on divine right, and not on the will of the nation. They no longer saw him in public, except when he passed rapidly in his carriage, with the Empress by his side, or showed himself with her on the balcony of the palace. He shut himself up in the Tuileries, and no longer received any one except the members of his family, or the great dignitaries of the Empire. The people began to murmur, as they had against the other Austrian woman, and Marie-Louise was not much more popular than her aunt had been. They recalled the gracious Joséphine, with her smile, her affable manners, the services which she had rendered, her many acts of charity, and the sacrifice imposed upon her. Marie-Louise was only endured at all because she brought peace, the happy peace so ardently desired, so many times promised, and so often broken. After the return of the court to Compiègne, on the 5th of April, Napoleon held only one meeting of the Council, gave no private audiences, and but one for the diplomatic corps. The few times that he appeared in public he was very silent, and seemed enervated. On one occasion he became absolutely motionless in the middle of the room, and stared at the floor for 5 or 10 minutes without saying a word. Then, as if coming out of a trance, he made a sign to Marie-Louise, and retired to his apartment. He had a bad cough, and was always fatigued. But nevertheless the preparations were pushed for the journey to the Low Countries, where he wished to show the new Empress to the former subjects of the House of Austria. Marie-Louise was to have her voyage de noces to the departments of the Escaut, the Meuse, and the Rhine, in the countries where her ancestors had reigned for centuries. He thought that the old loyalty of the Flemish population would be revived at the dazzling vision of an Archduchess of Austria, united to their new sovereign. "Metternich," he said to the Comte, "you will come with us?" "To Brussels, sire. Is it not a little too soon?" Napoleon understood the allusion to the delicate role which an Austrian Minister of Foreign Affairs would play in the provinces so recently annexed to the Empire, and modified his proposition. "At least," he said, "you will accompany us as far as Cambrai?" Metternich bowed in sign of acquiescence. During the days which preceded the departure for Flanders, Napoleon received him even more cordially, and seemed to wish to prolong his stay in France indefinitely. On the 29th of April Napoleon began his journey. Accompanied by the Empress, he took the route for Belgium by way of Saint-Quentin, Cambrai, and Valenciennes. In his suite were the royal couple of Westphalia, the Queen of Naples, the Viceroy of Italy, and the Grand Duke of Würzburg, also Prince de Schwarzenberg and Comte de Metternich, who were respectively the ordinary envoy and the extraordinary ambassador of Austria. The two persons last named were to leave the party at Cambrai. The Emperor had thought it desirable as companion to Marie-Louise to have a German princess with them, so Catherine of Württemberg was chosen. Augusta of Bavaria, the wife of Eugène, had also been considered, but much to her disappointment was left out, because she was thought to be mal élevée. She consoled herself, however, with the reflection that this Habsburg Archduchess was of common birth in comparison with a princess of the ancient house of Wittelsbach. At any rate, Eugène was a member of the party, as the Emperor had wished to show him particular honor, on account of his mother. Then there was the Chief of Staff, Berthier; also the Minister of the Marine, the Secretary of State, and the households of the Emperor and Empress, over 50 persons in number. The entire party included 122 individuals, transported in 35 carriages; and in addition there was an escort of over 600 men, selected from the different corps of the cavalry of the Guard. It was almost like mobilizing a corps d'armée. Before visiting Brussels, Napoleon descended the Scheldt upon a flotilla of war, entered Antwerp to the salutes of the cannon of the fortress, took part in the launching of a new warship, the Friedland, inspected all the fortifications on the coast and the frontier, and showed himself to the Hollanders. Everywhere he ordered new public works, stimulated the authorities, reprimanded the clergy, and astonished the inhabitants, even if he did not arouse their enthusiasm. In all the places they visited the Emperor distributed his usual presents: the crosses of the Legion d'Honneur, the snuff boxes with his portrait, the rings with his initial. For Marie-Louise he reserved the role of benefactress, of conqueror of hearts, in which Joséphine had excelled. It was Louise who in his name was to give money to the poor, watches, chains, rings, and bracelets, to the maidens who welcomed her with flowers, adding the few gracious words which doubled the value of the presents. In short, it was to her that the journey was dedicated. Napoleon exerted himself to please her and to draw her out, but she never opened her mouth. Never a kind word, never a smile for any one. At the balls given in her honor she refused to dance even a single time. In her visits to the manufactories of lace she paid not one of those little compliments of a connoisseuse, in which the other excelled, and which would have flattered the pride of the makers. In short, this insignificant woman, so unworthy of the great man, whose destiny she shared, seemed to make it her task to be as disagreeable as possible to these Belgians whose hearts were so disposed to love her. Without doubt, apologizes one of her historians, she did not venture to let herself out, because it was difficult for her to find words readily. She was obliged to make mentally the translation of the German phrase which came to her naturally, and thus to reform the construction. Her natural timidity and inexperience increased her embarrassment, and she displayed on all occasions a rigidity which nothing could unbend. No doubt it was also due to timidity that she appeared to the audience at the theatre very red, very embarrassed personally, with features absolutely devoid of expression. When on the return to Brussels an actor recited a new line, "Que par le monde entier, Louise soit bénie," she arose to bow her acknowledgment, was taken suddenly ill, and obliged to leave her place. Joséphine would have seized the occasion to call forth redoubled cries of enthusiasm. Mais elle ne sait pas, ou ne veut pas, ou ne peut pas. In the end she succeeded in causing around her a general feeling of malaise. The Emperor himself took on an air of constraint. From time to time he made an apparent effort to address some remarks to his wife, to which she hardly replied, and the conversation ceased at once. On one occasion, when she visited the fine museum at Brussels, she seemed to be much interested in an excellent portrait of her illustrious great-grandmother, Maria Theresa. But when they proposed to hang it in her salon at Laeken, she replied, "No, indeed, the frame is too old." At Bruges she visits at Notre Dame the tomb of Charles the Bold and Mary of Burgundy, but the 3 centuries, the 15 emperors, the 20 generations, which separate her from these ancestors in gold and enamel, do not awaken in her even a thought, much less a word or a prayer. On her return in ancient France, at Lille, Boulogne, Dieppe, Havre, Rouen, she passes by, ever haughty and impassible, without a word, without a smile. In fact, not one of the acclamations which saluted her during this long journey of a full month seemed to move or interest her in the least. It was rather a strange coincidence, to say the least, that during this visit to the ancient dominions of the House of Austria she did not receive a single letter from her father. The one which she found at Lille on her return filled her with joy. It was to her like an angel of consolation, and she reread it more than 10 times. The general impression which she produced upon the people, however, was negative rather than unfavorable. A comparison with Joséphine was inevitable, and the general verdict was that if the Emperor had gained by the change, the nation had lost. During his absence Napoleon had not entirely forgotten Russia. From the Chateau of Laeken, near Brussels, he wrote Alexander to thank him for his congratulations on the occasion of his marriage. In his letter he makes an allusion to the Polish question. "My feelings for you are invariable, like the principles which direct the relations of my empire. Your Majesty will never have occasion to complain of France. The declarations which I made last December are the whole secret of my policy.
I shall reiterate them as often as the occasion presents itself."
Napoleon seemed to think that this letter was equivalent to a treaty, and should be just as satisfactory; but Alexander felt differently. Caulaincourt soon discovered that the Czar regarded Napoleon's communication only as a manifestation of good will, and was not at all reassured by it. In fact, the patience of Alexander was exhausted, and he sent Kourakin, his ambassador at Paris, peremptory orders to obtain a positive answer from the Emperor as to whether or not he proposed to ratify the treaty. The poor old man was obliged to arise from his sick bed, and force the door of Champagny to solicit a reply which the Minister had been ordered not to give him. Upon his return from Flanders, the 1st of June, Napoleon was informed of these proceedings, and directed Champagny to reply to Kourakin that, as his journey had been consecrated entirely to internal affairs, he had been obliged to put aside all matters pertaining to foreign policies. With the coming of spring, the Russians had resumed along the lower Danube the operations which had been suspended during the winter, and there was every reason to believe that the Turks, overwhelmed by superior numbers, would soon be forced to cede the principalities to the Russian Empire. At Vienna such a result was viewed with dismay, and Metternich was instructed, if possible, to secure from Napoleon a revocation of the concessions made to Alexander. When the ambassador took the matter up with the Emperor a few days after his return, Napoleon said, "It is your fault." He then pointed out that the hostile preparations of Austria had forced him, at Erfurt, to make certain engagements with Alexander, in order to assure the cooperation of Russia, which was essential to his plans. Now it was impossible for him to tear up a solemn agreement, and violate his plighted word. This would furnish Russia with a just excuse for an immediate rupture. He thus gave Metternich to understand that this time they had asked of him the impossible. Admitting as a fait acquis the annexation of the principalities, Napoleon said, "This act of Russian aggrandizement will form one day the basis of the reunion of France and Austria." He thus indicated the Austrian alliance as a probable eventuality in the future. At the same time Napoleon was indiscreet enough to talk with the Austrian ambassador as freely as he would have done with his own ministers. He spoke of Alexander in a tone of disdainful pity. "The Emperor has good intentions," he said, "but he is a child." With his prodigious loquacity, which continued to grow upon him, he unveiled the secrets of his diplomacy. "It would be necessary for me to be God," he remarked, "to decide that Poland should never exist. I cannot make a promise which I am unable to keep." Finally Napoleon made up his mind to finish once for all this important affair, which had been left in suspense for 3 months. He sent for all the correspondence, and reread it. Then, on the 1st of July, he called Champagny to him, and dictated his reply, to be transmitted through Caulaincourt. "What does Russia mean by her language?" he said. "Does she want war? Why these continual complaints? Why these injurious suspicions? Does Russia wish to prepare me for her defection? I shall be at war with her the day that she makes peace with England." He then points out that Russia has secured as the fruits of the alliance Finland, so long coveted by Catherine, and the 2 principalities, and demands, "How has the alliance helped me? Did it prevent the war with Austria, which retarded affairs in Spain? Did the alliance make the success of this war? I was at Vienna before the Russian army was mobilized, nevertheless I made no complaints. Certainly they ought not to find fault with me. I do not wish to restore Poland. I have no desire to finish my career in the sands of her deserts. My duty is to France and her interests, and I shall never take up arms, unless forced to do so, for interests alien to my people. But I do not wish to dishonor myself in declaring that the kingdom of Poland shall never be reestablished, to make myself ridiculous in speaking the language of the divinity. No, I can never make an engagement to take up arms against people who have done nothing to me, who have served me well, who have displayed for me a constant goodwill and a great devotion." At the end of his dictation Napoleon softened his language. "If the Emperor is dissatisfied with the attitude taken by Russia,
he is none the less firm for the alliance. He has always walked in a straight line, and without hesitation. With regard to Russia, the Emperor is what he has always been since the peace of Tilsit."
In these long negotiations which turned around a phrase, Napoleon was certainly fundamentally right. He had offered all the concessions which his dignity and his interests allowed him to make. It must be conceded, however, that he had prejudiced his case by the manner in which he had conducted it. If Napoleon was right in the majority of the questions raised between him and Europe, taken individually, he was wrong in the ensemble, wrong in the universality of his pretensions, in the number, the audacity, the indefensible extensions of his enterprises, which in his case warranted extraordinary precautions and justified distrust. End of chapters 21 and 22.